So think about the last thing you broke. I don't know, maybe a glass or a rule or even a promise. Your mind just kind of immediately reconstructs the scene, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Like it draws this straight, undeniable line from your action directly to the outcome. So you bumped the table, the glass fell, it shattered.
Yeah.
And, without a doubt, you caused it.
Right. You are the cause.
Exactly. I mean, we base our entire legal systems, our scientific models, and honestly, our personal identities on this very basic assumption. If you do A, B happens.
Which makes sense. I mean, we kind of have to.
Right. But what if a second-century monk could use just like pure inescapable logic to prove that your action, the breaking and the broken thing itself are all entirely illusions?
That's a massive shift.
Right. What if the very foundation of how we perceive causes and effects is actually, well, a cognitive mirage, something hiding a much more complex and fluid reality?
I mean, it is a profoundly disorienting premise when you first hear it. Because, we rely on the predictability of cause and effect simply to get out of bed in the morning.
Yeah.
We assume the floor will hold our weight, because it always has. We assume the alarm clock caused us to wake up. But the philosophy we're diving into today, it doesn't just question those assumptions.
Right.
It systematically dismantles the entire intellectual scaffolding that holds them up.
And we have an incredibly dense but fascinating stack of sources to guide us through that dismantling today. Because this deep dive is, well, we're looking at extensive web notes, multiple translations of ancient texts.
Some really great translations, actually.
Yeah, specifically from renowned scholars like J. Garfield, Stephen Batchelor, and Frederick Strang. And we also had an in-depth video transcript analyzing a 2nd century CE philosophical masterwork.
The Mūlamadhyamakakarika.
Exactly. The Mūlamadhyamakakārikā, or translated the root verses on the middle way. And this was written by a Buddhist philosopher named Nāgārjuna.
One of the greatest thinkers in history, arguably.
Totally. And our mission for this deep dive is highly specific. We are going into extreme detail on only chapter 1 of this text.
Just the first chapter.
Just chapter 1. Because chapter 1 is entirely focused on the concept of causality. So we're going to examine causality through what the text calls its 3 spheres.
Right.
We're going to unpack the intense logical system known as Madhyamaka that Nāgārjuna uses to just deconstruct our idea of reality. And finally, we are going to translate this dense 2nd century philosophy into a highly practical mindset for navigating your day-to-day life.
Which I think is so important, and it is vital to establish the stakes right here at the outset.
Yeah, definitely.
Because when you start pulling at the threads of reality, when you start suggesting that causes and effects are illusions,
people panic.
They do. It is very easy to fall into a sense of dread. People can get super defensive, so we need to be clear. This is not a deep dive into abstract, mystical nihilism. Nāgārjuna is not trying to convince you that nothing matters, or that you can, just step into traffic without consequences, or that the universe is just some dark, meaningless void.
Which is such a relief, right? Because, a philosophy that tells you nothing you do matters isn't exactly useful for a curious listener who's just trying to improve their understanding of the world.
Far from it. What we are examining here is a precise, razor-sharp logical tool.
Okay.
It's a method. And it's designed to elucidate the true nature of phenomena and basically free us from our deeply ingrained, almost pathological belief that the world exists exactly in the rigid way it appears to us.
So it's about liberation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The ultimate goal here is liberation from suffering, which in the Buddhist context is known as samsara.
Right. The cycle of suffering.
Yes. But before we can understand how Nāgārjuna frees us, we really need to understand what he is freeing us from.
Okay, I like that.
We have to look at the intellectual landscape of the 2nd century to see what he was up against.
And I want to spend some real time on that historical and philosophical context. Because if we don't know what Nāgārjuna was fighting against, his arguments might just sound like abstract wordplay.
They definitely can seem that way out of context.
Right. So who is Nāgārjuna? And what was the dominant worldview that he was trying to tear down?
So from the historical context in our sources, Nāgārjuna is this figure who is kind of wrapped in a blend of history and myth.
Okay.
We know he was a monk. He was born into a Brahmin family in South India, right around the beginning of the 2nd century CE.
Okay, so a very long time ago.
A very long time ago. And he operated out of a monastery built by King Gautamiputra.
Which is important, right? The royal backing.
Extremely important. It tells us he had significant institutional backing. He wasn't just some fringe thinker shouting in the wilderness.
Right, he wasn't just a guy on the street corner.
Exactly. He was a central, highly influential intellectual figure. And he is deeply tied to the Prajnaparamita Sutras.
The perfection of wisdom.
Yes, which translates to the perfection of wisdom teachings. And these are foundational texts to Mahayana Buddhism.
And our sources mention this really fascinating legend attached to him, right? The one about the Buddha's teachings.
Oh, the Nagas.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's this legend that the Buddha foretold that his deepest teachings about the true nature of reality would eventually be misunderstood and lost.
Right.
And that Nāgārjuna was the one destined to recover them from the subterranean realm of the Nagas, which are these, like, mythical serpent beings.
Which is such a wild image.
Right.
But whether you view it as literal religious history or just a really powerful metaphor, it conveys a very clear message about his role.
That he was uncovering something hidden.
Exactly. Nāgārjuna was bringing something profound to the surface. He was reintroducing a radical perspective that the religious and philosophical establishment had basically lost sight of.
And that establishment's what we need to talk about, the
Yeah.
people he was reacting against.
Yes, he was primarily debating philosophers of the Abhidharma tradition.
The Abhidharma scholars. Okay, let's focus on them for a moment. How did they view reality? Because my understanding from the notes is that they were incredibly meticulous.
Oh, obsessively so.
Right. Like, they weren't just vague mystics meditating in a cave. They were basically early cognitive scientists and physicists.
That is actually an excellent way to describe them. The Abhidharma project was this massive, centuries-long taxonomic effort.
Like categorizing everything.
Everything. These scholars wanted to find the absolute fundamental building blocks of reality. They believed that if you broke the universe down far enough, past the level of everyday objects.
Like past tables and trees and stuff.
Right. If you kept zooming in, you would eventually hit indivisible fundamental units of reality. And they called these fundamental units dharmas.
Dharmas.
Okay.
So, is that similar to the Greek concept of atoms, like the unbreakable solid core of reality?
Very similar conceptually, yes. But these dharmas included not just physical matter. They included mental states, moments of consciousness, and even causal forces.
Oh, wow. So even an emotion or a thought could be broken down into a dharma.
Exactly. And the Abhidharma philosophers believed that while, say, a chariot might just be a conceptual label we put on a collection of wood and wheels.
Sure, we just name the pile of parts.
Right. But they believed the dharmas that actually made up the wooden wheels had inherent existence.
Inherent existence.
Yes. In Sanskrit, the term is svabhāva. It means own being or intrinsic essence.
Brahma. Yeah.
They believed these fundamental building blocks existed independently, under their own power, with their own absolute unchanging nature.
So they were solid, like fundamentally real independent things.
Yes. And because they believed in these solid independent building blocks, they naturally had to develop a very rigid theory of how these blocks interacted with each other.
Right, because if the universe is full of these solid independent little balls of reality, you have to explain how one solid thing bumps into another solid thing to create an effect.
Precisely. They built elaborate, highly complex models of causality to explain how these inherently existing dharmas influenced each other.
Okay, so that's the setup. That's the worldview.
That's the worldview. And this brings us to Nāgārjuna's method for dismantling it, which is wildly unorthodox.
Yeah, I found this part so interesting.
Because the Madhyamaka philosophy, the middle way, is not about proving a brand new theory of the universe to replace the Abhidharma theory.
Right.
In fact, our sources explicitly state that Nāgārjuna expresses no thesis of his own.
I genuinely struggled with that concept when I read the notes. I mean, how can you be one of the most famous philosophers in history and not have a thesis?
It sounds impossible.
Right. Like, what is he even arguing if he's not proposing a new model of reality?
Well, it's a radically anti-foundationalist approach. His method is entirely dialectical. He takes the theories of his opponents, the people arguing for a rigid, absolute reality based on svabhāva or inherent existence.
Right.
And he accepts their premises just long enough to expose their internal incoherence.
Oh, so he plays their game.
He plays their game perfectly. He takes their own logic and pushes it until it literally collapses under its own weight.
That's brilliant.
It is, because he believes we suffer because these concepts have a tyrannical hold on us. We suffer because we think things are absolutely independently real, and therefore we grasp at them or we fear them.
And we get totally stuck, which leads us directly to the target of Chapter 1.
Yeah.
Because of all the things to attack, right? The concept of the self, the nature of God, the definition of consciousness.
All big topics.
Huge topics. But he starts his entire masterwork by attacking causation.
He goes right for it.
And I was trying to visualize his strategy here. Why causation? And the analogy that kept coming to mind was debunking a magic trick.
Okay.
Like, if I want to prove an illusionist is faking it, I don't analyze the rabbit, and I don't inspect the magic wand. I go straight for the trapdoor on the stage.
Yeah.
Is causation the trapdoor of reality?
It is the ultimate trapdoor.
Wow.
Because the Abhidharma scholars, and frankly all of us in our modern daily lives, we use causality to prove that things are real.
Right.
If I can prove that an independent entity A acts upon an independent entity B, then A and B must have absolute inherent existence. They must be real if they can interact.
Because something fake can't cause something real to happen.
Exactly. Causation is the glue that holds a universe of separate, solid objects together.
So if you can dismantle the glue?
The entire structure shatters.
Man, that is a bold strategy.
It is. Chapter 1 targets causation because it's the bedrock. If you dismantle the idea that things have independent, inherent origins, the whole conceptual framework of solid, separate things just collapses.
And what's left? Just nothing.
No, what's revealed underneath is not a void, but an incredibly fluid, interconnected reality.
All right, so to dismantle the glue, we first have to understand what it's made of. Let's look at the architecture of an action as defined by the scholars Nāgārjuna was debating.
The three spheres.
Right. According to the text, any causal event can be conceptually divided into three spheres. First, the subject or the cause or the producer.
The thing doing the acting.
Right. Second, the relation, the causality, or the act of production itself.
The action.
The action. And third, the object, the effect, or the product. So causality effect.
And conventionally, we treat these three spheres as fundamentally distinct. We draw hard borders around them.
We do. And for a modern listener, I think a simple analogy like hitting a baseball doesn't quite capture the complexity of how rigidly we define these things.
No, it's too simple.
So let's use something more systemic. Let's talk about ecological systems, like introducing wolves into Yellowstone National Park.
Great example.
In our standard conventional minds, we say, the wolf is the cause.
Right.
The act of hunting is the causality. And the reduction of the elk population is the effect. We treat the wolf, the act of hunting, and the missing elk as three very real, distinct, separate facts.
Completely separate.
Right. The wolf is an independent entity. The dead elk is an independent entity.
And the Abhidharma philosophers had meticulously categorized these relationships.
Right. They had models for this.
Our sources detail the four conventional conditions of causality that these scholars accepted as absolute truth. And these are what Nāgārjuna directly targets.
Let's walk through these four conditions because this is the setup. These are the specific theories he is going to dissect.
Okay, so first, there is the efficient condition, or the primary cause.
Efficient condition.
This is the root motive, or the primary power that initiates an event. So in your Yellowstone analogy, it's the biological drive and physical action of the wolf hunting. It is the primary engine of the change.
Okay, the biological engine. That makes perfect sense. Got it.
Second is the percept-object condition. Now, this usually applies to mental causality and perception.
Mental causality.
Yeah. It's the idea that for a perception to occur, an independent object must exist out there to be perceived. The object causes the mental state. So the presence of the elk causes the wolf to see an elk.
Oh, I see. The external object essentially reaches into the mind and causes a perception.
Precisely. Third is the immediately preceding condition, and this deals with the flow of time. It states that one discrete moment must completely cease for the next discrete moment to arise.
So no overlapping.
Right. The moment of the elk being alive must end, and that ending acts as the immediately preceding condition for the moment of the elk being dead to begin. It's a strictly linear sequence.
Cause finishes, then effect begins, like a baton pass in a relay race.
That's exactly it. And finally, the fourth is the dominant condition.
Dominant condition.
This is the overarching purpose, environment, or end goal that governs the action.
Like the big picture.
Right. The broader ecological balance, or the instinctual need for the wolf pack survival, acts as a dominant condition facilitating the hunt.
Okay, so we have the primary engine, the objects of perception, the linear sequence of time, and the overarching environment or purpose.
Yes.
And honestly, to any rational person listening right now, these four conditions make perfect intuitive sense.
They do.
I mean, they are the foundation of biology, physics, and basic logic. So how does Nāgārjuna even begin to find a crack in a system that comprehensive?
He finds the crack by demanding absolute precision.
Oh, okay.
The Abhidharma scholars claim that these causes and effects have svabhāva. They have inherent independent existence.
Right, they are solid.
So Nāgārjuna essentially says, okay, if they are absolutely independent and real, let's see how they actually interact. And he does this using a dialectical progression, deploying his primary logical weapon.
And this is the famous one.
The tetralemma, the four extremes.
The tetralemma.
Yeah.
I have to say, I read this section of the translation multiple times, and it is a cognitive workout.
It is not easy reading.
No. Nāgārjuna states that nothing arises, meaning no effect is produced, in any of four ways.
Right.
Number one, it does not arise from itself.
Correct.
Number two, it does not arise from another.
Right.
Number three, it does not arise from both together.
Yes.
And number four, it does not arise from neither.
And that's the whole trap.
Right. And because there is no fifth option in logic, if causality doesn't fit into one of these four boxes, absolute causality just cannot exist.
That is the exact structure of the trap he sets. It is an exhaustive list of logical possibilities. If you claim that an inherently existing cause produces an inherently existing effect, that production must happen in one of these four ways.
So he says, let's test them.
Let's test them all.
Okay, let's take the heavy lifting right now. I want to spend significant time on each of these 4 points because this is really the core of the Madhyamaka philosophy. Let's start with extreme number one, not from itself.
Right, self-causation.
The text refers to this as self-causation or independent origination. What exactly is the claim he's debunking here?
The claim of self-causation is the idea that the identity of the cause and the effect are fundamentally the exact same thing.
Meaning what?
It means the essence of the effect is already present, latently, inside the cause. And some ancient philosophical schools actually argued this.
Really?
Yeah. They argued that because something cannot logically come from nothing, the effect must already exist within the cause, just waiting to manifest.
Oh, I get it. Like a Russian nesting doll. The effect is fully formed, just hiding inside the cause until the right moment.
Yes, but Nāgārjuna points out the immediate logical absurdity of this position.
Appreciate.
If an effect is already inherently inside the cause, if its essence is already fully present, then the act of production is completely redundant and pointless.
Oh.
If a thing already exists, why would it need to be produced?
Ah. If the shattered glass already exists perfectly inside my hand pushing it off the table, it doesn't need to shatter. The action does nothing.
Exactly. The classic example from the text is agricultural. A seed and a sprout.
Okay.
If the sprout is identical to the seed, if it's already fully there in essence, it doesn't need soil, water, or sunlight to be produced. The conditions are entirely irrelevant.
Because it's already a sprout on the inside.
Right. Furthermore, a seed is clearly not identical to a sprout. They possess different physical properties. They function differently. I mean, if a seed were identical to a sprout, you could eat a handful of seeds and claim you just ate a salad.
Uh-huh, right. Which you can't.
No. So identity fails. Self-causation collapses under its own logic. If the cause and effect are the exact same thing, no action actually takes place.
Okay, I follow that. Self-causation is out. But extreme number two is where my modern scientific brain just starts screaming in protest.
This is where it gets tough.
Not from another. The text calls this other causation.
And this is where Nāgārjuna's razor is the sharpest, and where Western listeners usually struggle the most.
Because it seems completely counterintuitive. I mean, if a seed and a sprout aren't the exact same thing, then they must be different things.
That's what we naturally assume.
Right. The wolf is definitively another entity compared to the elk. The rain is another thing that causes the flood. We observe separate objects causing things every single day. Why on earth is he saying effects don't arise from another?
We have to remember his target here. He is not attacking the conventional idea that a wolf and an elk are different.
Okay.
He is attacking the Abhidharma concept of absolute inherent otherness.
Inherent otherness, meaning they are absolutely solid in their separation?
Yeah. Yes. If causes and effects are entirely distinct, inherently separate entities, if they possess what the texts call otherness essence, then there is absolutely no bridge between them.
Wait, slow down. What do you mean by no bridge? If the wolf is inherently different from the elk, the bridge is the teeth. The bridge is the physical interaction.
I hear you, but if they are inherently independent, they are fundamentally sealed off from one another by their very natures.
I'm trying to picture this.
Let me use a structural analogy. Imagine two cliffs separated by a massive canyon.
Okay, two cliffs.
The cliff on the left is the cause, and it possesses its own absolute independent reality.
All right.
The cliff on the right is the effect, also possessing its own absolute independent reality. If they are truly inherently other, they are completely self-contained. They are sealed off.
Okay, I see the cliffs. They're totally separate.
Now, if the defining characteristic of a cause is simply that it is absolutely other than the effect, then we have a massive logical problem.
Why?
Because a rock is absolutely other than a sprout. Fire is absolutely other than a sprout. If there is no shared continuum, no underlying fluidity connecting them, then why doesn't a rock produce a sprout?
Oh.
As the translation by Stephen Batchelor phrases it. If an own thing does not exist, an other thing does not exist.
Oh. I think I see the mechanism here.
Tell me.
If the wolf and the dead elk are fundamentally absolutely separate realities, then the wolf hunting could just as easily cause a tree to spontaneously combust.
Yes.
Or a mountain to turn into gold. Because if the only rule is that they are different, well, everything is different from everything else.
Exactly. If they were inherently separate, causality would break down into complete randomness.
That's wild.
The Batchelor translation notes, and this is a great quote, "If, although the effect is not there, it is born from those conditions, why is an effect not born from what are not its conditions?"
So, why doesn't anything just cause anything?
Right. If you rely on absolute otherness as the mechanism of causality, you have no logical way to explain why a seed produces a sprout, but a pebble does not. They are both equally other than the sprout.
So specific relationships require a shared reality.
I do.
They require a connection. If they are totally separate, they can't touch. If they're exactly the same, they don't need to change.
Which brings us to extreme number 3, not from both.
Could causality be a combination of self-causation and other causation?
What do you think?
Well, based on what we just established, if the bridge is fundamentally broken on the left side because self-causation is redundant,
right,
and fundamentally broken on the right side because other causation leads to random chaos, mashing the two broken halves of the bridge together doesn't magically create a stable structure.
Precisely. Nāgārjuna dismisses this third option very quickly because it simply inherits the fatal logical flaws of the first two extremes.
It's just two bad ideas stacked on top of each other.
Exactly. You get the redundancy of identity and the chaotic disconnect of otherness. Combining two failed theories doesn't synthesize a functional one.
Which leaves extreme number 4, not from neither, which essentially means without a cause at all, spontaneous generation, a causality.
And this would mean pure chaos. If things don't arise from themselves, from others, or from both, perhaps they just pop into existence for no reason at all.
Like things just appearing out of thin air.
Right. But this contradicts our lived experience entirely, and it destroys the possibility of ethics, science, or any intentional action.
Yeah, I mean, if things arose without causes, you wouldn't need to plant seeds to get crops. Windows would spontaneously shatter without anyone bumping into the table.
It would be an unlivable universe.
So we are trapped. The tetralemma has completely boxed us in.
It really has.
We cannot logically claim that a cause and an effect are the exact same inherent thing. We cannot claim they are completely different, isolated things. We can't say both, and we can't say neither.
The logical scaffolding of causality is collapsing.
But wait, earlier we talked about the 4 conditions the Abhidharma scholars believed in.
Yes.
One of them was the immediately preceding condition, the flow of time. Cause finishes, effect starts. Does Nāgārjuna attack the physics of time as well?
Oh, he absolutely does, and this is perhaps his most devastating argument.
Really?
He addresses the temporal sequence directly. Let's look at the exact mechanism of a moment passing. For a cause to produce an effect, does the cause still exist at the exact moment the effect is born?
Well, let's use the Yellowstone example again.
Yeah.
The wolf bites the elk. The elk dies. Does the cause the bite still exist when the effect, the death occurs?
Does it?
Well, strictly speaking, no. The action of the bite is a past event by the time the state of death is realized. The cause precedes the effect.
Okay. But if the cause has completely ceased to exist, it is by definition a non-entity. It is nothing.
Right.
How can a non-existent thing exert a force to produce an effect?
Oh, wow.
As Garfield translates Nāgārjuna's question, If something has ceased, how could it be a condition?
This is bending my mind. You are asking about the literal gap between moments.
Yes.
If moment A completely finishes before moment B starts, there is a boundary line between them. But if moment A is totally gone, it has no power. It's like a ghost can't push a boulder.
Exactly. A non-existent past state cannot interact with the present state. There is a gap of nothingness, and causal force cannot travel through a void.
But wait, what if there is no gap? What if they overlap? What if the wolf biting and the elk dying are happening at the exact same time, bridging that gap?
Well, if they perfectly overlap, they are simultaneous.
Okay.
And if they're simultaneous, one isn't producing the other. They're simply existing side by side in the same moment.
Wait, really?
Think about it. For A to cause B, A must have temporal priority. It has to come first.
Right, the engine has to turn before the wheels move.
But if A precedes B and completely ceases, it can't interact with B. If A and B are present together at the exact same time, A isn't causing B, they are just co-arising.
So causality doesn't work sequentially because of the gap of nothingness, and it doesn't work simultaneously because then it's not causality, it's just synchronicity.
This is the ultimate conclusion of the dialectical progression.
Wow.
Therefore, the three spheres, the cause, the causality, and the effect, cannot inherently exist as absolute separate things interacting across time. They are completely empty of inherent absolute existence.
Okay, I have to stop you here.
Go.
Because we followed the logic, we've broken down the trapdoor, but I can feel the listener experiencing a genuine sense of intellectual vertigo right now.
Oh, I'm sure.
Because this sounds like the very nihilism we promised we weren't going to fall into.
It does sound like that at first.
Right. If the tetralemma proves causes and effects aren't real, and the physics of time prove they can't interact, does that mean the wolf didn't kill the elk? Does it mean if I stop eating, I won't starve?
Right.
Is this philosophy just telling me that nothing matters and my actions have no consequences?
And that profound sense of vertigo is the exact trap people fall into when they first encounter Madhyamaka philosophy. They confuse empty of inherent existence with completely non-existent.
Oh, okay.
But Nāgārjuna is not saying things don't happen.
So if I walk into traffic, a car will still hit me.
A car will absolutely hit you, and the conventional X-ray will show a very real broken bone, and you will experience very real pain.
Good to know.
This is where we must introduce the core, liberating insight that resolves this massive tension, the union of the two truths.
The two truths.
This is the mechanism that saves us from the nihilistic void.
Okay, the union of the two truths. Conventional and ultimate. Let's break these down thoroughly because this is the lifeline. Let's start with truth number one.
Truth number one is the conventional truth.
Okay.
This is the realm of what Buddhism calls dependent origination. In this conventional realm, things do exist and function, but they exist as a limitless, centerless web of conditions.
In the outline, it was referred to as a karmic fractal. But we need to be very careful with the word karma here, right?
Yes.
Because Western listeners often misinterpret it as some kind of cosmic justice system, like the universe punishing you for bad deeds.
That's a crucial distinction. In this philosophical context, karma simply means action and the infinite rippling conditions that arise from that action.
Okay, so just action and consequence.
Exactly. Dependent origination means that every single event is simultaneously the effect of an infinity of prior conditions and the cause of an infinity of future effects. It is a vast, fluid network.
A web.
A huge web. And here is the key to conventional truth. Causes and effects are co-defined, co-evolving, and most importantly, they are imputed by the mind.
Imputed by the mind.
Yes.
Meaning reality is just a continuous flowing process, like a massive river.
Great analogy.
And our human brains, because we need to survive, look at that river and say, okay, Snip, this part of the water is the cause. Snip, this part of the water is the effect.
Exactly.
But reality didn't make those cuts. The universe didn't draw a black line between the wolf, the bite, and the elk. We did.
Exactly. We conceptually isolate parts of the continuous web to make sense of the world. And conventionally, it is highly useful, even necessary, to draw those boxes.
Because I need to know not to put my hand in the fire.
Right. We need to know that planting wheat gets us wheat. We need to know that introducing wolves changes the ecosystem. But we suffer, and we fall into philosophical traps when we mistake our conventional mental boxes for absolute unchangeable reality.
When we think the box is real.
Exactly. Which brings us to truth number two.
The ultimate truth.
Emptiness.
Right.
Everything is empty of svabhāva. Everything is empty of inherent independent existence. There is no solid, unchanging essence inside a cause or an effect. They are fluid.
But how is this a union? How can something exist conventionally as a cause, but be ultimately empty? Don't those two truths contradict each other?
This is the paradoxical genius of Nāgārjuna, and arguably one of the most profound insights in human history.
Okay, lay it on me.
Things can only cause other things because they are empty.
Wait, emptiness isn't the opposite of causality.
Emptiness is the fundamental prerequisite for causality.
I don't think I get that.
Let's look at the mechanism. If a cause had a permanent, absolute, inherent essence, if the Abhidharma scholars were right and things possess svabhāva, they could never, ever change.
Because they'd be locked in.
Exactly. If a seed was absolutely inherently locked into seedness, it could never transform into a sprout. It would be a frozen, immutable atom of reality.
Oh, I see it now.
You see it.
Yes. For the universe to function, for time to flow, for a wolf to move, for an elk to die, for things to affect one another, they must be fluid.
They have to be.
They must lack a rigid, permanent essence. If the universe were made of those solid, independent things, if reality was just a box of immutable marbles bumping into each other, nothing could ever organically grow, adapt, or change.
Exactly.
Emptiness is the very condition that makes the functional world possible.
That is exactly it. As the textual commentaries summarize, everything is empty of inherent existence precisely because everything is dependently arisen and vice versa.
They need each other.
One truth implies and actively enables the other. They are two sides of the exact same coin.
So the three spheres, the cause, the causality, the effect, they aren't fake in the sense of a hallucination.
Right.
But they're like illusions. The texts use words like reflections, mirages, dreams, echoes. They are there, yet not there.
That is the perfect way to grasp it. Think about a reflection in a mirror.
Okay.
It is there conventionally. You can see it, you can point to it, you can describe its colors. But if you try to grab it, if you try to isolate its inherent solid essence, your hand just hits flat glass.
Because it's not a thing itself.
Right. It is entirely dependent on the mirror, the light, and the object being reflected. It has no independent reality of its own. It is empty of inherent existence, yet it functions visually.
You can't have a cause without an effect. They define each other mutually.
Like up and down.
Exactly. You can't have up floating in space by itself.
Huh.
It only exists as a relational concept to down. Causes and effects don't exist objectively out there, waiting to be discovered by scientists. They are relational concepts our minds overlay onto the vast, dependently arisen web of reality.
And this brings us to the crucial pivot of our deep dive.
Which is?
Understanding the tetralemma and the two truths on an intellectual, philosophical level is exhilarating. But Nāgārjuna didn't write the Mūlamadhyamakakārikā simply to win debates against Abhidharma scholars.
He wasn't just dunking on them.
No, he wrote it as a manual for human liberation.
So let's translate this. What does this dense second-century dialectical logic mean for you, the listener? How does realizing that the three spheres of causality are an empty, dependently arisen mirage actually help you when you log into work tomorrow, or when you interact with your family, or when you are facing a massive crisis?
It helps because our daily psychological suffering almost always stems from falling into one of two extremes. We bounce violently between two painful beliefs about causality. The first extreme is absolute determinism, which is rooted in reifying the past.
Give me a tangible, modern scenario. Let's move away from seeds and sprouts.
Sure. Let's take a massive career failure.
Ouch.
Say you launched a business, you made a critical strategic error, and the company went bankrupt.
Okay, I'm devastated.
Right. Now, the mind that believes in absolute inherent causality will look at that event and say, I am the absolute cause of this failure. The failure is an absolute permanent stain on my identity. I am doomed by my past causes.
We reify the trauma. We treat the past mistake not as a fluid moment in a web of conditions, but as a heavy, solid, radioactive object that we have to drag around forever. We think the cause is permanently locked in our effects.
Exactly. You feel completely trapped by what you did.
And what's the other extreme?
The other extreme is absolute chaos or nihilism. You experience that same career failure and you conclude, well, the market is completely random. Nothing I do matters. There is no reliable cause and effect. The world is rigged, so why bother trying again?
Right. Both of those extremes lead to paralysis. So how does the union of the two truths offer a way out of that?
Nāgārjuna offers the middle way. You apply the conventional truth by acknowledging the web of conditions.
Okay, so I say, yes, I made a mistake.
Exactly. Yes, you made a strategic error. You can learn from it. You can use the concepts of cause and effect as highly functional tools to plan your next venture. But you apply the ultimate truth by refusing to treat that failure as an absolute reality with inherent essence. You stop grasping it so tightly.
The text translates this approach as acting without acting.
It sounds like a Zen riddle, but it's actually a deeply practical cognitive behavioral strategy.
Tell me more.
If you recognize that the three spheres of causality, you as the actor, your action of making the business decision, and the result of the bankruptcy, are just mere designations after the facts, you can navigate the world without that immense, grinding psychological weight.
You stop trying to force absolute control over situations because you realize absolute causality is a myth.
Right.
I think about this in terms of relationships, especially toxic ones.
Mm-hmm.
We often stay stuck in misery because we try to control every single variable.
Oh, absolutely.
You think, if I just perfectly control my behavior, the cause, I will perfectly guarantee that they treat me well. The effect.
And when the effect doesn't happen the way you rigidly designed it, you suffer immensely. You feel despair, or you blame yourself entirely.
Because you falsely believed you had absolute causal power.
Yes.
But you don't. You're just one node in a limitless, centerless fractal of dependent origination. You can provide good conditions, you can communicate clearly, you can set boundaries, but you are not the sole absolute cause of the relationship's outcome.
You can't be.
The other person is an intersection of a billion past conditions, too.
The psychological relief of this realization is profound. If phenomena like a career failure or a difficult partner, or even a massive success lack inherent absolute existence, then they also fundamentally lack inherent desirability or inherent repulsiveness.
Wait, explain the mechanism of that. Why does emptiness eliminate desirability and repulsiveness?
Okay, so when we see an effect we desperately want, say, a promotion to a specific title, our minds project an inherent absolute goodness essence onto that title.
Like the title itself is made of pure happiness.
Yes. We think that job, in and of itself, from its own side, is the absolute key to my happiness. Because we believe it has inherent existence, we experience intense craving, we grasp at it with clenched fists.
And conversely, if we see an effect we fear like losing that job, we project an absolute badness essence onto the event.
Exactly.
We treat it as an inherently terrifying object, and we experience paralyzing anxiety and aversion.
But Nāgārjuna's logic proves that these effects have no inherent essence. They are empty, fluid, dependently arisen moments.
Right.
A job title is not inherently good. A job loss is not inherently bad. They are just temporary configurations of infinite conditions.
Wow.
When you truly internalize this mechanism, you stop conceptually indulging in craving or aversion. You realize you are chasing or fleeing from reflections in a mirror.
Which means you can engage in the continuous flow of life with a light touch.
A very light touch.
You can still play the game, you can still strive for the promotion, you can still work on the relationship, you can still try to build a business, but you aren't fighting against rigid, unchangeable facts. You are deeply aware that you are participating in a conceptually constructed relational reality.
The ancient texts say that by understanding the emptiness of causality, we are stilling all thought and finding perfect peace.
Finding perfect peace.
But I want to be clear, it is not a dead, passive, empty peace. It is a luminous, highly active peace. You are freed from the tyranny of outcomes.
Because the outcome isn't real in the absolute sense. It's just a reflection.
Right.
You don't cry when a reflection of a fire goes out, and you don't try to warm your freezing hands on it. You just appreciate it for what it functionally is, without demanding that it be something it's not.
You use the conventional tools of cause and effect without being conceptually used and abused by them.
This has been an incredibly rigorous journey.
It really has.
We started by looking at the trapdoor of reality. We explore the Abhidharma, scholars, and their belief in solid, independent building blocks of reality.
The dharmas.
Right. We deconstructed the three spheres of causality, the cause, the causality, and the effect.
And we navigated the immense logical weight of the tetralemma, proving step by step that things do not arise from themselves, they do not arise from inherently separate others, they do not arise from both, and they do not arise from neither.
We even looked at the physics of time and the gap of nothingness to prove causality isn't absolute.
Which is such a mind bender.
It totally is.
Yeah.
And we saw how that seemingly devastating, reality-breaking logic actually leads us directly to the union of the two truths.
Yes.
We discovered that emptiness and dependent origination are not opposites. They are the exact same mechanism. Emptiness is what allows the universe to breathe and move.
And finally, we arrived at the liberating middle way, where we can live and plan and act without rigid, painful attachment to outcomes. We learned how to act without acting.
It's a profound shift in perspective. It takes a heavy, solid, deterministic world that often feels like a trap and turns it into something fluid, workable, and surprisingly beautiful.
It's life-changing once you see it.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to ponder as you step back into the conventional world. We spent this entire time talking about the emptiness of causes and effects out there in the universe.
Right, the external stuff.
The wolf, the elk, the business, the relationship. But what about the system making those observations? What about in here?
Oh, that's the big question.
If every cause is just a conceptually imputed effect of an infinite web of prior conditions, and the concept of an independent inherent cause is fundamentally empty, what does that mean for the concept of you? When you make a choice today, are you the absolute independent inherent cause of that action? Or are you simply the beautifully empty space where an infinite universe of conditions is briefly coming together to make a decision? Think about that next time you fiercely take credit or brutally take the blame for an effect in your life, and next time you think the diagnostic x-ray of your life is showing you a single, clean, broken line of cause and effect.
Yeah.
Remember, the machine is an illusion, the waters are deeply fluid, and that might just be the most liberating truth of all.